There's no question that Disney has had a major problem with their villains since the turn of the century. Ever since King Candy, there hasn't been a single villain of theirs to be universally beloved like many in the olden days still are, with many ranging from divisive to flat out hated, which is something that many, myself included, have noted is very odd for a company that's always been known for making such great villains. But as I've stressed in many other videos, an often overlooked reason for a lot of Disney's issues in the 2010s and 2020s can actually come down to their acquisition of Pixar and their creative management taking over Disney. Because simply put, what works for Pixar simply does not work for Disney, and the immense amount of problems Disney has had finding their footing since their acquisition only proves that. But instead of going over that for the 100th time, today I'd like to take a look at their most well-received villain since King Candy, with that being Tamatoa, and go over how he perfectly demonstrates why Pixar's approach to storytelling doesn't work with Disney. And there will be spoilers for both Moana and pretty much any other Disney or Pixar movie I bring up ahead. So in case you don't want something of theirs ruined, you might just want to keep on the lookout. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so if you're a frequent watcher of my channel, you'll know that I've been blaming Pixar for a lot of Disney's problems in the mid-2010s and early 2020s for a while now, especially when it comes to their villains. I even dedicated one of my first videos to this same topic, which you can find a link in the description to. But if you look at the way Disney used to tell their stories compared to how they do in the new millennium, as I similarly did in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to, Pixar's influence on the company since Disney's acquisition of them is very apparent. And that's what leads us to Tamatoa and what makes him so different from other Disney villains. Now, I could point out the obvious and say that he's only in the movie for about 10 minutes and doesn't contribute much to the plot, in contrast to most other Disney villains that are usually way more present throughout their stories and are even apt to cause the entire conflict. But what I want to focus on specifically is his defeat, because in the end, he's left stuck upside down, unable to move, all alone with nothing but his own thoughts to keep him company. And this is supposed to be an appropriate end for him because the theme behind Moana is identity, accepting who you are and finding worth with who you are on the inside. And in contrast to the other characters who come to learn this lesson, Tamatoa believes that what's on the outside is most important, which is why he goes out of his way to look as shiny and glamorous as possible, because he believes that if he looks magnificent on the outside, it can make up for how empty and insecure he feels on the inside. So in the end, he's still alone and unfulfilled, with the shiny objects he placed so much value on serving as an anchor, leaving him trapped, vulnerable, and worthless. Which is a pretty poetic end for the character that's meant to be the straw man to the movie's themes. But the thing is, how many people would actually pick up on that if I hadn't just spelled it out for them? To put it another way, the significance of Tamatoa's comeuppance can easily be lost on the viewer because what it means isn't made readily apparent, especially if you don't watch the post-credit scene, where it's made much more obvious. Though even then, the whole thing about what's on the inside being more important still might not come across too well. What I'm trying to say here is, as a writer myself, what they were going for with Tamatoa definitely wasn't bad and fit the theme of the movie very well, but they should have dedicated more time to it, or at least have found a way to put the post-credit scene into the actual movie. I don't know exactly how, but it shouldn't have been relegated to after the end credits, since that only makes it look like a last-minute joke when it actually holds a lot of thematic significance. And let's face it, if many adults might have a hard time picking up on what Tamatoa's comeuppance actually means, how are children supposed to understand it? Again, what they were going for works if you understand what they're saying, but it's way too subtle for many to pick up on. And a major reason older Disney villains worked is because not only was their comeuppance given a lot more attention, but it's also much more obvious that they deserve it. Like, for example, the evil queen repeatedly tries to murder Snow White just because she's more beautiful than her, so her falling to her death, getting crushed, and eaten by a bunch of vultures is nothing short of poetic justice. Or Maleficent curses an innocent baby for the mortal sin of not being invited to a party, openly revels in being evil, and repeatedly tries to murder Prince Philip when he tries to break the curse. As a result, even a 5-year-old can understand why she gets a sword through the heart. And the same goes for Ursula, as her insanely evil nature is made crystal clear right from the beginning, and by the end, she's so far gone that you won't find anybody not cheering when she's shish kebabbed and electrocuted to death. And even somebody like Hades can most definitely qualify here, as even though he's a blast to watch and steals the entire movie, it's still made extremely obvious that he's the bad guy and should be stopped. Hence why even his biggest fans, old and young, will concede that his defeat is something he had coming. And for one of the most obvious examples of this I can give, Scar murders his own brother and tries to kill his young nephew, all to secure a throne, does an absolutely terrible job as king, won't own up to his mistakes, and then tries to kill his nephew again when he comes back to claim his birthright, even though it's obvious he's lost either way. So even if he's one of the most beloved villains in Disney history, there's no question that his fate at the jaws of the hyenas is completely deserved, especially because he had tried to throw them under the bus after everything they had done for him. And even if you look at Disney villains whose defeats are more in line with Tamatoa's in terms of tying into the theme of their story, such as Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, it's still done better than it was with him, because Gaston is meant to be a contrast to the Beast, and help drive home the moral that true beauty comes within, and dedicates a lot of time to him doing that job, as I went over in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too. And it's presented as obvious enough for the viewer to pick up on, but not so obvious that they're left rolling their eyes. So as a result, Gaston being left to fall to his death is completely warranted, because his ugly personality is made very clear long before he takes his final plunge. Or similarly, Jafar is a man who believes that the most important thing in life is power, and thus goes about getting as much of it as he can by any means necessary, and consequently, he could never possibly see the value in a simple street rat or understand how he could ever possibly be a threat to him. Because a movie like Aladdin shows that it's who a person is on the inside and not where they came from that determines their worth. And to that end, Aladdin ends up getting everything he ever wanted, while Jafar is left the most powerful being in the universe without any means to use that power, being forever trapped in the prison of his own lust and pride. And while that does sound similar to what happens to Tamatoa, the difference is that the significance of his defeat is a lot more obvious, especially to children. And then there's perhaps the closest example to Tamatoa himself that I can give, which is that of Madame Mim from The Sword and the Stone. Because similar to Tamatoa, she's only in the movie for a short period of time and is never seen again after she gets her comeuppance. But the reason Madame Mim works better is because she spends most of her screen time gloating about how evil she is, cheats to try and get the edge over Merlin, and is defeated by him using brains instead of magic. And that last one is a very important theme throughout the movie, as Merlin keeps stressing to Arthur that magic can't solve all his problems and that an education is the most valuable thing he can ever have, and is able to drive this point home by using his extensive knowledge to defeat Mim. So as a result, her comeuppance tying into the theme of the movie is made a lot more apparent, and is frankly way more effective at driving the intended point home than Tom Tamatoa just getting stuck on his back because of a geyser. Now I know by this point you might be thinking, but if the way Disney villains were defeated goes all the way back to Walt Disney, then how can Pixar be to blame for what's happened to them? Because the villain's defeat, tying into the theme of the film, is a speciality of Pixar, not Disney. Sure, Disney did do it sometimes, but more often than not, they were simply defeated by the most practical means available. For example, Lady Tremaine simply loses by Cinderella marrying the prince, Cruella de Vil is run off the road and denied her fur coat, and Shang Yu is blown up by fireworks. Or even when their defeat does have narrative significance, there is nothing thematic about Ursula getting run through with a wooden ship, Gaston falling to his death, or King Candy getting incinerated. They die and/or are defeated in that fashion because that's what makes the most logical sense. Again, because these movies do such an effective job of selling these characters to the audience, and particularly children, as bad guys, they understand that they deserve to have bad things happen to them. But on the flip side, when Pixar does have a villain in one of their stories, they're usually a lot more committed to making sure that the defeat itself has some sort of thematic significance. And for a few examples of that, Sid tortures toys, so they come to life and scare him straight. Al stole to get rich, so he's left right back where he started. Stinky Pete wanted to be a priceless collectible, so he's given to a girl who draws on her toys. Henry J. Waternoose was determined to save his company's good name at any cost, so he's exposed, arrested, and has his company taken over by somebody who saw the value in children that he didn't. Chick Hicks wanted to beat the king, so he does, but loses everyone's respect and is shown how empty success can be. Lotso believed that kids don't love their toys and that they're all trash, so he's condemned to become trash by a man who loved his childhood toys. Hardscrabble only sees worth in results and insists on remaining completely stoic, so in the end is proven dead wrong and left stunned because of it. Ernesto de la Cruz valued fame and being a beloved musician over everything else, even murdering his best friend to get it and trying to kill a child to preserve it. So in the end, his crimes are exposed and he becomes hated by all. Urkel loves to win and getting to rub it in, so he loses and gets laughed at the same way he laughed at others. Really, the only Pixar villains whose actual defeats don't tie directly into their characters' themes are Hopper, as his need for control doesn't really factor into being eaten, Syndrome, whose death is more a joke than anything else, Skinner, since even if it's a hollow victory, he actually gets what he wants and subsequently stops harassing Linguini, Charles Muntz, who simply falls to his death, and Mordo, who's crushed to death. But even then, in some of these cases, the theme of the movie does still have something to do with why they go out the way they do. For example, Skinner was trying to get rich by making a mockery out of his employer and denying his heir what he was owed, so he's subsequently fired, loses everything he worked for, and sees others try to restore Gusto's good name. It just so happens that his story doesn't end there. Or even in the case of Charles Muntz, they wanted his death to have more thematic significance, but they decided that wrapping up Carl's story was more important, hence why he simply falls and is never mentioned again. And the thing is, if you look at how well most of these movies and villains are received, it's obviously a formula that works. But as I said at the beginning, it's a formula that works for Pixar, not Disney. Again, a villain's defeat tying into the theme of the movie is something they have done, but it wasn't a requirement. Just as long as the villain was defeated, it didn't usually matter how it happened. But because of Pixar's influence, it's caused them on several occasions to try and tie a villain's defeat into the movie's themes. And since Disney and Pixar have two different styles, it usually doesn't work. Now, sure, in a lot of these cases, the fact that they had problems writing the villain as a character does have a lot to do with it, which is why I chose to focus on Tamatoa, as he actually is well written, perfectly ties into the movie's theme, and is generally well liked by audiences. And yet, his defeat and what it means can be lost on many, and especially children. And that last point in particular is important because one has to keep in mind, children are supposed to be the target audience here. And in most of the movies I just went over, the writers were mindful enough to make it clear why the villain lost. And in the more thematic cases, spell out why they were defeated the way they were. But not in Tamatoa's case. Now, as I said at the start, his lack of screen time and the fact that they relegated one of his most important moments to the end credits is mostly to blame for this. But even that ties back into another thing Pixar has a penchant for doing as well, which is not having a villain at all. And we all see how well that particular trend has gone for Disney. Like I already said, just because it works for Pixar doesn't mean it'll work for Disney, and they are taking way too long to figure that out. Because simply put, instead of being made a bigger part of the story, and thus why he gets the comeuppance he does would be more obvious, Tamatoa is in the movie only to be the one person to go against the movie's theme. But since he only gets one scene, even if it is a memorable one, he's not as effective at getting the intended point across. Though what also doesn't help is that his defeat is also a logical one given the circumstances, making it all the more likely that its thematic significance would be lost on the audience. To put it very simply, Disney needs to learn how to be Disney again and stop taking pages out of Pixar's way of doing things. Because until they do, they're never going to get a villain right again. There are plenty of other ways that Pixar's influence has negatively impacted Disney, yes, but the villains have definitely been where they're suffering from this the most. Because as Tamatoa shows, even when they appear to get it right, they aren't doing it as well as they could be. Okay, that pretty much ends this video. So now I'd like you to tell me, do you believe that Tamatoa's defeat and how it ties into the theme of Moana could have been handled with a little less subtlety, and that Pixar's style rubbing off on Disney is to blame for the way it's presented? Or do you believe it was done just fine and that I was all wrong about what I said? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because you do not have to agree with me about anything I said in this video if you don't want to. You are entitled to your own opinion on this or any other topic we discuss here, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.